He never stole, never hurt anyone, never committed a crime. Juan woke up early every day, put on his uniform, and headed to the hospital, where he cared for lives with dedication and humility. But on an ordinary morning, everything collapsed. Handcuffed in front of his own home, taken like a criminal, Juan watched his life turn to dust in the cold hands of bureaucracy. Years of hard work and sacrifice, ignored by a system that doesn't see faces, only status. While his family cried outside, he was thrown into a cruel silence where time stood still and hope faded. But this isn't just Juan's story. It's the painful portrait of thousands of immigrants who live in the shadows, building a country that refuses to call them its own.
Juan woke up every day at 4:30 a.m. in the same quiet neighborhood in South Florida where he had lived for almost 3 decades. The alarm barely rang, and he was already up, his bare feet touching the cold kitchen floor as he put the water on to boil. His wife, Marta, was still sleeping in the next room, and the whole house seemed suspended in time, wrapped in a reverent silence he respected like a ritual. The blue janitor uniform hung on the closet door, clean and pressed. Juan put it on with a kind of silent pride. The badge from the hospital where he had worked for 16 years was his only visible ID, the closest thing to an official identity he could carry without fear. Before leaving, he passed through the living room to look at the framed photo from his oldest son Daniel's graduation, now a civil engineer, and his daughter Sofia, who was about to finish nursing school. He whispered a brief prayer in Spanish, always asking the same thing: "Protect my family, and let me come back tonight." In the car, an old 2002 Honda, Juan listened to Spanish-language radio stations. He never talked about politics, never drove over the speed limit, never took risks. His life was a carefully choreographed dance between shadows and light, between the constant fear of being discovered and the hope of remaining invisible. At the hospital, he was respected by everyone. "Juan, you are the heart of this place," said the head nurse. He just smiled shyly and replied, "I'm just doing my part." What Juan didn't know was that this Tuesday morning would be the last time he would step into his home as a free man.
Juan's routine at the hospital was his safe harbor. He knew every corner, every face, every unspoken story lingering in the hallways. His cleaning cart glided silently as his mind wandered to thoughts of his children, the future, and bills waiting to be paid. That morning, as he swept the floor of the pediatric ward, he heard the sweet laughter of a child playing in the nearby bed. The sound brought a brief lightness, a breath amidst the silent worries that consumed him. During his break, Juan sat in the small break room where few noticed him beyond a polite smile. He pulled out his phone and saw a message from Sofia. "Dad, I got an internship at the university hospital. Thank you for everything." A gentle warmth filled his chest. Behind his quiet appearance, this man carried dreams that crossed borders, hopes no one could take away. But time, relentless as ever, always holds surprises. At the end of his shift, as he walked out to the parking lot, Juan didn't see the white van watching him. He didn't hear the steady footsteps approaching. He had no idea that the invisibility he had so carefully cultivated was about to be shattered. "Juan Miguel Hernandez?" the authoritative voice asked as ICE agents appeared in front of him, blocking his way. Not fully understanding what was happening, Juan felt the ground slip beneath his feet. The arrest wasn't about guilt. It was about fate. The sound of the handcuffs was like thunder breaking the morning silence. Juan tried to explain, mumbling in a low voice that he had always worked hard, that he had never hurt anyone, that his life was dedicated to his family and his job. But his words were lost in the cold stares of the agents. On the way to the patrol car, his neighbor, Mrs. Alina, appeared at the door. "Juan, what's going on?" He could only shake his head, too drained to respond. Marta ran out, tears streaming down her face, clinging to her husband's arm as he was taken away. The following days were a blur. Juan was placed in a cold, impersonal cell, far from the warmth of the home he had worked so hard to build. Each night, the darkness seemed to grow heavier on his shoulders. He didn't see his children, didn't hear Marta's voice, only the echo of bars and the oppressive silence. At the hearing, the judge looked at the paperwork with indifference. No crimes, no record, just the simple fact that he was there illegally was reason enough for deportation. Juan tried to plead his case, tried to tell his story, but his voice sounded small, drowned out by the bureaucratic machine. The deportation was decided with no chance for appeal, no mercy, as if a lifetime of honesty could be erased by a stamp on a document. Meanwhile, across the city, Marta struggled to hold together a family that was starting to fall apart. Daniel and Sophia tried to comfort their mother, but the pain was deep, silent, a void threatening to swallow them all. Juan knew his story wasn't over, but in that moment, inside the cold cell, he felt the crushing weight of exile. The days in prison felt far too long to fit into a single calendar. Juan woke to the metallic sound of doors, breathed the heavy air of the cell, and closed his eyes, trying to picture Marta's face, Sophia's smile, Daniel's steady gaze. The longing for home was an open, throbbing wound. Among the few voices he heard, none were friendly. There were men, like him, who were there for being too invisible to the system, lost between files, forms, and rushed judgments. Juan tried to hold on to his dignity, but with each denied visit, each dropped call, hope seemed to slip further away. At one of the hearings, the court-appointed lawyer looked tired, reciting empty phrases without ever meeting Juan's eyes. "Your case is complicated, but the system rarely shows mercy." Juan felt a knot tighten in his chest, the bitter realization that he was just another number. Back home, Marta tried to keep the routine going, but her eyes carried the weight of fear and uncertainty. The children took turns visiting her, holding back tears in front of the strong mother who had always been their pillar. One night, before falling asleep, Marta whispered to herself, "Juan, hold on. For us. For them." It was a desperate prayer, a silent promise. Meanwhile, at the detention center, Juan wrote letters that were never delivered, sharing memories, pleading for justice, clinging to fragments of his past life, trying to resist being erased. But time marched on, relentless, and the day of deportation drew near. A sentence no one at the hospital, not even his neighbors, ever imagined would fall upon that good, hard-working, invisible man. At the airport, Juan felt the weight of the world collapse on his shoulders. The tight security, the hurried footsteps, the sound of rolling suitcases, and the automated announcements formed a cruel symphony, announcing his fate. He looked back, searching every face for a last glimmer of hope, an unspoken goodbye. Marta, with red eyes and a steady hand, held Daniel's tightly. Sophia clung to her older brother, trying to be strong despite the anguish tightening her chest. "Please, don't leave me alone," Juan whispered, more to himself than to the agents. But there was no room for pleading. The system was impersonal, unrelenting. The tears stayed trapped, the words caught in his throat. Upon arriving in Cuba, the hot, humid air hit him like a jolt.
The familiar streets felt foreign, like a dreamscape he no longer recognized. The family he had left behind in a distant past was no longer there. Friends, neighbors, routines, all had been erased by time. Juan walked through the streets of a changed Havana, carrying within him the memory of a life he had built on another continent. His identity had been reduced to a piece of paper, a shadow that no longer belonged anywhere. He knew the road ahead would be hard, lonely, but in his heart a small flame still burned, the hope that somehow justice might one day find its way to him.
The days in Cuba dragged on like an endless desert. Juan tried to adapt to a reality that felt like an invisible prison. The once familiar streets were now mere reflections of a life that no longer belonged to him. The old voices sounded distant, and people looked at him like a stranger, a man marked by exile. He found shelter in a small rented house on the outskirts of Havana, where the stifling heat mixed with the silence of absence. He tried to maintain a routine, waking up early, searching for jobs that rarely appeared, but the shadow of deportation followed him like a relentless ghost. Every night, Juan sat on the porch, staring up at the starry sky, remembering the silent prayers from his home in the United States. March's face and the children's appeared vividly in his mind, and the longing for what they had built gripped his chest like a fist of iron. In a rare clandestine phone call, Marta spoke to him, her voice thick with tears. "Juan, no matter where we are, our family is stronger than any wall. We're waiting for you." Those words were a balm, a thread of hope in the midst of so much darkness. Juan knew his fight was far from over. Even from afar, he carried the responsibility to rebuild, to endure, to someday, maybe, return. But in that moment, the man who had crossed oceans, who had lived in silence and in shadows, felt more vulnerable than ever before.
Juan spent months reflecting in the solitude of that forced exile. He, who had never taken anything from anyone, who woke up early to work, who dreamed of giving his children a better life, now found himself treated like a criminal. It was painful to think that all his effort, his honesty, his life, dedicated to building something in the United States, was being ignored, as if it meant nothing. He remembered the kind words of the nurse at the hospital. "You are the heart of this place." And now that heart had been ripped from his chest, shattered by a system that saw him only as a number, an invisible threat, an illegality. Juan felt the deep injustice faced by thousands of immigrants every day, people who, despite their sacrifices and contributions, were hunted down and punished as if they were dangerous criminals, with no real right to defend themselves, no room for their stories to be heard. In that bitter reflection, he understood that it wasn't just his life at stake, but the dignity of all those who, like him, lived in the shadows of the law, in a limbo of fear and exclusion. Deportation didn't erase their memories, but left an open wound carried deep in the soul. Being good shouldn't be a crime, Juan thought, gazing at the Cuban sky, feeling the weight of injustice just as present as the heat of the night. And despite everything, he held on to a quiet hope that one day the world might finally see immigrants as people, not as statistics, not as the guilty without guilt.